The first thing Takashi noticed when the truck stopped wasn't the barbed wire or the watchtowers or even the rifles held by young American soldiers whose faces still carried the softness of boyhood. It was the smell of grilled meat drifting across the Wisconsin afternoon, sweet and smoky, mingling with the scent of fresh-cut grass and something else he couldn't quite place, something that would later reveal itself as the distinctive aroma of Coca-Cola syrup mixed with carbonated water, a smell that would come to define his entire understanding of what it meant to be captured, to surrender, to live. He had expected death. They all had. The 47 men crammed into the transport vehicle had spent the long journey from the West Coast preparing themselves for the inevitable execution that awaited prisoners of war, especially Japanese prisoners, especially after everything that had happened at Pearl Harbor, especially after the stories they'd heard whispered among themselves about the brutality of American soldiers, stories their commanders had fed them like poison, stories designed to ensure they would fight to the death, rather than face the dishonor and horror of capture. But Takashi had not died on that beach in the Pacific where his unit had made its final stand. He had not died when the grenade he'd been clutching failed to detonate. He had not died when the American Marines had found him half buried in sand and blood, and he had not died during the long weeks aboard the ship that brought him to California, and he had not died during the processing at the temporary facility where they'd been photographed and questioned and examined by doctors who touched them with a clinical gentleness that felt more disturbing than violence would have been. Now, standing in the afternoon light of Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, in the summer of 1944, Takashi realized with a sensation that felt like vertigo that he might not die at all, and this realization was more terrifying than any death could have been because it meant he would have to continue living, continue breathing, continue existing in a world where everything he had believed about honor and duty and the proper way for a soldier to end his life had been stripped away like skin from bone. The guard who approached them was wearing a cowboy hat, not a military cap, and this detail struck Takashi as so absurd, so fundamentally wrong, that he almost laughed, though laughter had left his body somewhere in the Pacific along with so many other things. The guard was chewing gum, his jaw working in a lazy rhythm that suggested a man entirely at ease with his circumstances, a man who did not see the 47 prisoners before him as dangerous enemies or subhuman creatures but as something closer to an inconvenience, a job to be processed, men to be managed rather than destroyed. "All right, fellas," the guard said, and though Takashi's English was limited, he understood the casual tone, the almost friendly drawl that colored the words. "Let's get you sorted out. Follow me, and no funny business, though I reckon most of you are too tired for funny business anyway." He grinned, showing white teeth, and gestured toward a long, low building that looked more like a barn than a prison. "We'll get you fed first. Bet you're hungry." Takashi glanced at the man beside him. Hiroshi, who had been his commanding officer before capture, had dissolved all hierarchies, and saw his own confusion reflected in Hiroshi's eyes. Fed first. Not interrogated, not tortured, not executed, but fed. The concept seemed to belong to a different universe, one operating under rules that made no sense according to everything they'd been taught about warfare and surrender and the treatment of prisoners. Inside the building, long tables had been set up, and the smell of food grew stronger, overwhelming Takashi's senses in a way that made his stomach clench painfully. He hadn't eaten anything substantial in days, maybe weeks. Time had become fluid and unmeasurable during the journey, and now the sight of actual plates piled with actual food seemed like a hallucination, a cruel trick his starving brain had conjured to torment him in his final moments before execution. But the execution didn't come. Instead, American soldiers, young men with sunburned faces and easy smiles, began placing plates in front of the prisoners, plates loaded with hamburgers and fried potatoes and beans and bread, more food than Takashi had seen in months, more food than seemed possible in a world at war. And then, as if the universe had decided to completely abandon all pretense of making sense, one of the soldiers placed a bottle in front of him, a glass bottle with a distinctive curved shape and a red label, and said something in English that Takashi didn't understand but that sounded encouraging, almost cheerful. Hiroshi leaned over and whispered, "It's Coca-Cola. I've heard of it. American drink. Popular before the war." Takashi stared at the bottle as if it were a grenade. The condensation on the glass caught the light from the windows, making the bottle seem to glow with an inner luminescence. He had been prepared for death, for torture, for starvation and disease and every form of suffering he could imagine, but he had not been prepared for Coca-Cola, for hamburgers, for American soldiers who smiled and called them fellas and wore cowboy hats as if war were just another day at work. The cognitive dissonance was so profound that Takashi felt something crack inside his chest, some fundamental understanding of reality splitting apart like ice under spring sun. If the Americans were not monsters, if they did not intend to kill him, if they were going to feed him hamburgers and give him Coca-Cola, then what did that mean about everything he'd been told, everything he'd believed, everything he'd been willing to die for? And if those beliefs were lies, then what was he? Who was he? What did honor mean in a world where enemies offered you cold drinks and hot food and treated you with a casualness that suggested your humanity was simply assumed rather than questioned? He picked up the bottle with trembling hands. The glass was cold against his palm, shockingly cold, impossibly cold, as if it had been stored in snow. He brought it to his lips and drank, and the sensation that flooded his mouth was unlike anything he'd ever experienced, sweet and bitter and sharp all at once, bubbles exploding against his tongue, the liquid so cold it made his teeth ache. It was delicious. It was terrible. It was American. It was everything he'd been taught to hate, condensed into a single bottle of carbonated sugar water, and it was the best thing he'd ever tasted, and this fact made him want to weep with shame and confusion and something else he couldn't name, something that felt dangerously like relief. Across the table, he watched other prisoners experiencing similar moments of dislocation, men who'd been ready to die now confronting hamburgers and Coca-Cola with expressions that ranged from suspicion to wonder to a kind of exhausted surrender that went deeper than military defeat. Kenji, who'd been a university student before conscription, was crying silently as he ate, tears streaming down his face while he mechanically lifted the hamburger to his mouth, chewed, swallowed, repeated. Yoshiro, the oldest among them at 45, sat frozen with a fork full of beans halfway to his mouth, staring at it as if he'd forgotten what food was supposed to be. And Masato, who'd tried to kill himself 3 times during the journey, who'd been restrained and watched constantly, was laughing, a high, wild sound that made everyone turn to look at him, laughing and eating and drinking Coca-Cola with an abandon that suggested he'd moved beyond sanity into some realm where nothing mattered anymore, where the rules of honor and shame had simply ceased to apply. The days that followed blurred together in a sequence of small shocks, each one chipping away at the edifice of beliefs Takashi had constructed around the concept of honorable death and enemy cruelty. They were given beds with mattresses and clean sheets. They were given soap and told to shower. They were given clothes that were worn but clean and sufficient. They were given medical examinations by doctors who treated their wounds and infections with a thoroughness that suggested they actually cared whether the prisoners lived or died. They were given access to a recreation area with books and games and even a baseball diamond where American guards would sometimes join them in games that dissolved, however temporarily, the boundaries between captive and captor. But it was the small interactions, the casual moments of human contact, that proved most destabilizing. The guard who learned to say good morning in Japanese and would greet them each day with a mangled but sincere "Ohayo gozaimasu." The cook who noticed Takashi didn't eat pork and began preparing chicken for him without being asked. The camp commander who allowed them to construct a small shrine where they could pray, who even attended the dedication ceremony and stood respectfully while they performed their rituals, his cowboy hat held over his heart in a gesture that bridged cultures through its sheer awkwardness and sincerity. Takashi began keeping a journal, writing in tiny characters on paper he was given by a guard who noticed him sketching in the dirt with a stick. He wrote about the weather, about the food, about the strange routines of camp life, but mostly he wrote about the feeling of existing in a liminal space between worlds, no longer Japanese in any way that made sense according to the code he'd been raised with, but certainly not American, caught instead in some intermediate state that had no name, no traditions, no guidelines for how to be. One evening, about 3 months into his captivity, Takashi was sitting outside the barracks watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded him painfully of home when a guard approached him, a young man named Charlie who couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, with red hair and freckles and a perpetually cheerful demeanor that Takashi had initially found offensive in its refusal to acknowledge the gravity of their situation. Charlie was carrying 2 bottles of Coca-Cola and a brown paper bag that smelled like chocolate. "Mind if I sit?" Charlie asked, and though Takeshi's English had improved significantly through necessity and exposure, he still found the casual friendliness of the question jarring. In Japan, a guard would never ask permission to sit. A guard would command, would assert authority through every gesture and word. But Charlie always asked, always seemed genuinely interested in whether his presence was welcome, as if Takeshi's comfort mattered, as if the power dynamic between them was negotiable rather than absolute. Takeshi nodded, and Charlie settled onto the ground beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and handed him one of the Coca-Cola bottles and opened the paper bag to reveal chocolate chip cookies, still warm, crumbs of melted chocolate clinging to the wax paper. "My mom sent these," Charlie said, offering the bag. "She bakes every week, sends me enough to feed an army. Which I guess is appropriate, since I am in the army." He laughed at his own joke, a sound so unguarded and genuine that Takeshi felt something loosen in his chest. "You got family back home? In Japan, I mean?" It was a question Charlie had never asked before, and Takeshi suspected he'd been working up to it for weeks, trying to find the right moment, the right words. Takeshi took a cookie, bit into it, tasted butter and sugar and chocolate, tasted comfort and home and everything that word meant across all cultures and languages. "Mother," he said carefully, forming the English word with precision. "2 sisters. Young sisters." He held up fingers to indicate their ages. 8. 11. Charlie nodded, his expression becoming more serious. "Must be hard. Being away from them. Not knowing if they're okay." Takeshi had learned enough English by then to understand that Charlie wasn't probing for intelligence, wasn't trying to extract information. He was simply being human, acknowledging the universal experience of worry and separation that war inflicted on everyone it touched, regardless of which side they fought for. And this acknowledgement, this simple recognition of shared humanity, felt more subversive than any act of violence could have been, more dangerous to the structures of war and nationalism than any weapon. "Your family?" Takeshi asked, attempting reciprocity though the words felt strange in his mouth. Charlie's face lit up. "I got 3 brothers, all older, all in the service. My dad's a farmer, grows corn and soybeans down in Iowa. Mom worries herself sick about all of us, writes letters every day. I got engaged before I shipped out, to a girl named Mary Beth who I've known since we were kids." He pulled out his wallet, showed Takeshi a photograph of a young woman with dark hair and a bright smile, wearing a flowered dress, standing in front of a white farmhouse. "We're gonna get married when this whole mess is over. Gonna have a farm of our own, raise kids, live quiet." Takeshi studied the photograph, trying to reconcile this image of domestic dreams with the reality of war, with the fact that Charlie was his enemy, that they were supposed to hate each other, that the entire global machinery of violence and nationalism depended on them seeing each other as less than human. But looking at Mary Beth's smile, thinking about Charlie's mother baking cookies and mailing them across thousands of miles, thinking about his own mother and sisters in Japan, probably hungry, probably scared, probably wondering if he was alive or dead, Takeshi couldn't find the hate he was supposed to feel. He could only find a profound exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness with the entire concept of war and everything it demanded of human hearts. "She very pretty," Takeshi said, handing the photograph back. "You lucky man." Charlie grinned. "Yeah, I am. Luckiest guy in the world, to have her waiting for me." He paused, then asked quietly, "You got a girl back home?" Takeshi shook his head. "No girl. Was to be arranged. Marriage. After war." He gestured vaguely, trying to encompass in that single motion the entire world that had existed before, the future that had been planned for him, the life that would never happen now because he had failed in the most fundamental duty of a Japanese soldier, which was to die rather than surrender. They sat in silence for a while, drinking Coca-Cola and eating cookies and watching the sunset, 2 young men who should have been mortal enemies sharing a moment of peace so fragile it seemed to exist outside of time entirely, suspended in amber, preserved against the chaos of the world around them. Takeshi thought about the strangeness of this moment, about how in another universe, another configuration of reality, he and Charlie might have been friends, might have attended university together, might have shared meals and stories and dreams without the weight of war pressing down on every interaction, distorting every gesture of kindness into something complicated and painful. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Charlie said suddenly, his voice soft, almost confessional. "I think about how weird it is that we're all just people, you know? Like, you're sitting here eating my mom's cookies, and you probably got a mom who makes you cookies too, or rice cakes or whatever Japanese moms make, and we're both just guys who want to go home and see our families and live our lives. But somebody somewhere decided we had to be enemies, had to try to kill each other, and none of it makes any sense when you actually sit down and talk to a person instead of shooting at them from a distance." Takashi didn't have the English to fully respond to this, but he understood the sentiment, felt it resonating in his own chest like a bell that had been struck. He nodded, said simply, "Yes. Is strange. Very strange." As autumn arrived and the Wisconsin landscape transformed into a riot of reds and golds that reminded Takashi painfully of Japanese maples, the rhythms of camp life became almost normal, though normal was a word that had lost most of its meaning. The prisoners worked in the camp gardens, in the kitchen, in various maintenance roles that kept the facility running. They received mail, heavily censored letters from home that arrived months late and were often more painful than receiving nothing, because they spoke of a world that no longer existed, of people and places that had been destroyed by bombs and fire and the grinding mechanics of total war. Takashi learned that his family's home had been destroyed in an air raid, but his mother and sisters had survived, had moved to the countryside to stay with relatives. The relief of knowing they were alive was tempered by the knowledge that they were suffering, that his capture had brought shame upon them, that they were probably going hungry while he ate hamburgers and drank Coca-Cola and lived in relative comfort in an American prison camp. The guilt was crushing, made worse by the fact that he couldn't truly wish himself back in the war, back in the fighting, back in a situation where death was the only honorable option. He wanted to live. Despite everything, despite the shame, despite the dishonor, he wanted to continue breathing, continue existing, continue experiencing the strange new world he'd found himself in. Winter came hard and cold, snow falling in quantities that astonished the prisoners who'd never seen such weather. The camp provided them with warm coats and boots and gloves, and Takashi found himself experiencing snow for the first time in his life, catching flakes on his tongue like a child while American guards laughed and showed them how to make snowballs, how to build snowmen, engaging in playful warfare that bore no resemblance to the real warfare that had brought them all to this unlikely place. It was during this winter that Takashi befriended a guard named Robert, an older man in his 30s who'd been a schoolteacher before the war and who brought books to the camp, books he'd share with prisoners who wanted to improve their English. Robert taught Takashi about American history, about the Civil War and the Revolution and the complicated story of a nation built on both ideals of freedom and the reality of slavery, a contradiction that Robert acknowledged without defensiveness, presenting his country's history with the same critical eye he might turn on any subject. "Every nation has blood on its hands," Robert said one evening while they sat in the camp library, a small room lined with donated books and old magazines. "Every country does terrible things in the name of survival or progress or manifest destiny or whatever fancy term they use to justify cruelty. The question isn't whether we've done wrong, it's whether we can acknowledge it, learn from it, do better." Takashi struggled to formulate his response in English. "Japan also. Many bad things. Korea. China. Many bad things done." It hurt to say this, felt like betrayal, but also felt necessary, honest in a way that pierced through the propaganda and nationalism that had shaped his understanding of the world. Robert nodded. "War brings out the worst in everybody. Makes monsters of ordinary people. But it also shows you what people are capable of when they choose to be human instead of just soldiers following orders." He gestured around the library, around the camp, around the entire strange experiment in treating prisoners like human beings. "This place, what we're doing here, it's not perfect. There are other camps where prisoners are treated badly, where guards are cruel, where the whole thing is just a continuation of war by other means. But here, some people decided to try something different. To remember that you're people, not just enemies." This conversation stayed with Takashi long after it ended, burrowing into his understanding of the world like a seed that would take years to fully germinate. The idea that humanity was a choice, something you could decide to practice even when everything around you suggested it was easier, safer, more practical to simply follow orders and dehumanize the enemy, this idea felt revolutionary, dangerous, capable of undermining the entire structure of warfare and nationalism that had defined his life. Spring arrived with a sudden fury of green, the Wisconsin landscape exploding into life after the long winter. The prisoners were allowed to plant a garden, and Takeshi found himself working in the soil, planting seeds, tending to growing things, engaging in an act of creation that felt redemptive after so much destruction. He planted vegetables that would be harvested by other people, by prisoners who would arrive after he'd been transferred or repatriated or whatever eventual fate awaited him. He would never eat these vegetables, never see them mature, but he planted them anyway, an act of faith in a future he couldn't see, an investment in continuity and growth that transcended his own immediate circumstances. Charlie was transferred to a different post in May, and he came to say goodbye to Takeshi, bringing with him a letter from his mother, addressed to my son's Japanese friend and containing a recipe for chocolate chip cookies and a photograph of the Iowa farmhouse and a few lines expressing hope that Takeshi would survive the war, would return to his family, would find peace and happiness in whatever life waited for him on the other side of all this violence and separation. "You keep writing to me," Charlie said, his voice thick with emotion they were both pretending not to feel. "War's gotta end eventually. When it does, you come visit. Come to Iowa. Meet Mary Beth, meet my folks. We'll have a farm by then, probably have some kids running around. You can teach them Japanese, tell them about your country. Promise me you'll come." Takeshi couldn't promise that. He couldn't imagine a future where such a visit would be possible, where the wounds of war would have healed sufficiently to allow for casual international visits, for friendships between former enemies, for a world where he could walk up to a farmhouse in Iowa and be welcomed as a friend rather than a symbol of everything that had been destroyed, everyone who had been lost. But he took the letter, took the photograph, promised to write, and when Charlie left, Takeshi felt the loss in a way that surprised him with its intensity, as if he'd lost a brother rather than a guard, as if the boundaries between captor and captive had dissolved so completely that only human connection remained, raw and painful and precious. Summer brought news of victories in Europe, of Germany's surrender, of concentration camps liberated and atrocities revealed that made the prisoners at Camp McCoy re-examine their own experiences, their own treatment, their own nation's actions. The guards shared newspapers, and Takeshi read about Dachau and Buchenwald and the systematic murder of millions, read about the Holocaust with a growing horror that forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about his own country, about what was happening in the territories Japan had occupied, about the reports of atrocities he'd heard and dismissed as enemy propaganda. Robert continued their discussions about history and responsibility, about the burden of living through times that would be remembered as inflection points in human civilization. "You can't control what your country does," Robert said. "But you can control what you do. How you treat people. Whether you choose to see humanity in others, even when they're designated as your enemy. That choice, that's the only thing you really own in this world." As summer turned to autumn again, a year and a half after Takeshi's arrival at Camp McCoy, rumors began circulating about the war's end, about new weapons, about events in the Pacific that were too large to fully comprehend from the limited information available to prisoners. And then in August, the news came that Japan had surrendered, that atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that the war was over, and the prisoners at Camp McCoy reacted with a complex mixture of relief and grief and shame and confusion that defied simple categorization. Takeshi learned that Hiroshima was gone, that the city where his mother's cousin had lived, where he'd visited as a child and eaten okonomiyaki and watched paper lanterns float on the river during Obon, had been erased in a flash of light and heat beyond imagination. The scale of death was incomprehensible. The horror was absolute. And yet, mixed with the horror was relief that the war had ended, that the dying would stop, that perhaps now there could be healing, rebuilding, a return to some kind of normalcy, however distant and unimaginable that normalcy seemed. The camp became quieter after the surrender, prisoners retreating into themselves as they processed what peace meant, what would happen to them now, whether they could ever return home, and what home would even mean after everything that had happened. Some prisoners committed suicide, unable to face the shame of survival and surrender. Others embraced the end of war with an almost manic relief, as if they'd been holding their breath for years and could finally exhale. Takeshi found himself in neither camp, existing instead in a state of numb acceptance. He would go home eventually. He would face his family, his community, his country. He would carry with him the memory of Camp McCoy, of hamburgers and Coca-Cola and cowboy hats, of guards who'd treated him like a human being, of Americans who'd shown him kindness when they had every reason to show cruelty, of friendships that shouldn't have been possible but were, of a photograph of a farmhouse in Iowa and a recipe for chocolate chip cookies and the words of a schoolteacher who'd taught him that humanity was a choice you made every day, in every interaction, regardless of what uniforms people wore or what flags they saluted. The repatriation process took months. The prisoners were processed through various facilities, examined, questioned, prepared for their return to a Japan they barely recognized from the descriptions that reached them, a Japan occupied by American forces, a Japan transformed by defeat in ways both profound and mundane. Takeshi wrote letters to Charlie, to Robert, to the camp commander, thanking them for their treatment, for their kindness, for showing him a version of his enemy that contradicted everything he'd been taught to believe. In December of 1946, more than 2 years after his arrival at Camp McCoy, Takeshi boarded a ship bound for Japan, carrying with him a small box containing letters, photographs, the recipe for chocolate chip cookies, and a bottle of Coca-Cola he'd been saving, not to drink but to keep as a tangible reminder of the strange interlude between war and peace, between enemy and friend, between the person he'd been and the person he'd become. The journey across the Pacific was long and uncomfortable, the ship crowded with repatriated prisoners, all of them facing the same uncertain future, the same complicated homecoming. They didn't talk much among themselves, as if words had become inadequate to express what they'd experienced, what they'd survived, what they were returning to. Takeshi spent his days on deck, watching the ocean, thinking about water and how it connected rather than divided, how the same Pacific that had been a battlefield now carried him home, indifferent to human conflict, eternal and patient. Japan was different. That was the first thing Takeshi noticed upon arrival, the strangeness of his homeland, the way it felt both familiar and alien, as if he'd been gone for decades rather than years. The cities were damaged, buildings destroyed, infrastructure broken, but life continued with a determined resilience that reminded him why he'd loved this country, why he'd been willing to die for it. People bowed, smiled, went about their daily routines with a stoic grace that transcended defeat. His mother wept when she saw him, gripping his hands with a strength that belied her small frame, touching his face as if to confirm he was real, solid, alive. His sisters, older now, almost grown women rather than the children he remembered, stared at him with a mixture of joy and uncertainty, as if they'd become strangers during his absence. The community's response was more complicated. Some people treated him with sympathy, understanding that survival was not the same as cowardice, that surrender under circumstances beyond one's control did not erase honor. Others looked away when he passed, whispered behind his back, made clear their belief that he should have died rather than allowed himself to be captured. Takeshi understood both reactions, felt the weight of shame even as he rejected its fundamental premise. He had survived. This was not a crime. This was simply a fact, and he would build his life from this fact, would move forward rather than remaining paralyzed by regret and what-ifs. He found work in a factory, rebuilding the industrial infrastructure that would power Japan's recovery. The work was hard, physical, mind-numbing in its repetition, but it was also redemptive in a way, contributing to something larger than himself, helping to create a future that didn't depend on war and conquest but on production and trade and peaceful coexistence. He watched as American occupiers brought new ideas, new systems, new ways of organizing society, and though the occupation was complicated and often painful, Takeshi found himself appreciating the echoes of Camp McCoy in some of the policies, in the attempts to build democratic institutions, to reform education, to reshape Japan into a nation that could never again descend into the militaristic madness that had led to such catastrophic destruction. Years passed. Takeshi married a woman named Yuki who worked in the factory office, a quiet woman with gentle hands and a pragmatic approach to life that he found comforting. They had children, 2 sons and a daughter, and he raised them with stories about duty and honor but also about the importance of seeing humanity in all people, even enemies, especially enemies. He told them about Camp McCoy, about hamburgers and Coca-Cola and cowboy hats, about guards who'd treated him with kindness, about friendships that had crossed boundaries that were supposed to be absolute. He wrote letters to Charlie over the years, though the correspondence was sporadic, complicated by distance and language barriers and the simple demands of daily life. But occasionally a letter would arrive from Iowa, telling him about the farm Charlie had bought, about his children, about Mary Beth and his parents and the rhythms of Midwestern life. Charlie sent photographs, showing Takeshi a world so different from his own yet recognizably similar in its fundamental concerns, family and work and the small joys that made life worth living. In 1974, 28 years after his repatriation, Takeshi received a letter from Charlie inviting him to visit, saying that Mary Beth wanted to meet him, that his children wanted to hear stories about the war from someone who'd lived it, that enough time had passed that maybe they could sit together without the weight of history crushing them, could simply be two old men remembering their youth and the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Takeshi showed the letter to Yuki, uncertain whether he should accept, whether such a visit would be appropriate, whether reopening this part of his past was wise. Yuki read the letter carefully, then looked at him with her clear, practical gaze and said, "You should go. You've been carrying these memories for decades. Maybe it's time to complete that journey, to close that circle." So in the summer of 1975, Takeshi flew to America for the first time as a free man rather than a prisoner, landing in Des Moines where Charlie met him at the airport, older and grayer but still recognizable, still wearing that easy smile that had first greeted him at Camp McCoy. They embraced awkwardly, two men who'd been separated by war and time and distance now reunited in the sterile environment of an airport terminal, and then Charlie drove him through the Iowa countryside, through fields of corn and soybeans that stretched to the horizon, talking constantly, filling Takeshi in on 30 years of life, asking questions about Japan, about his family, about his memories of the war and the camp. The farmhouse looked exactly like the photograph Charlie had shown him that evening at Camp McCoy, white clapboard with a wide porch, surrounded by fields and sky and the immense stillness of the American heartland. Mary Beth met them at the door, a handsome woman in her 50s with graying hair and Charlie's same warm smile, and she hugged Takeshi as if he were family, welcomed him into her home with a hospitality that transcended culture and language. That evening, they sat on the porch, drinking Coca-Cola from glass bottles that reminded Takeshi sharply of his first meal at Camp McCoy, and they talked about the war but also about everything else, about children and work and aging and the universal experiences that bound all humans regardless of what country they'd been born in, what language they spoke, what wars they'd fought. Charlie's children came to dinner, adults now with children of their own, and they listened to stories about Camp McCoy with a curiosity untainted by the bitterness and rage that had defined the previous generation's relationship with Japan. Takeshi stayed for a week, helping with farm chores, playing with Charlie's grandchildren, eating Mary Beth's cooking and praising it with the same enthusiasm he'd felt for those first hamburgers in 1944. And one evening, as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of orange and purple, Charlie turned to him and said, "You know what I think about sometimes? I think about how lucky we are. Not because of the war, but because the war brought us together, gave us this friendship that never should have existed but does. Makes me think that maybe hope isn't crazy. Maybe people can learn to see each other as human beings instead of enemies. Maybe all the killing and hatred isn't inevitable." Takeshi didn't have a response that felt adequate, so he simply nodded, sipped his Coca-Cola, watched the sun sink below the cornfields. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from a beach in the Pacific to a prison camp in Wisconsin to a farmhouse in Iowa, a journey that had transformed him from a soldier prepared to die into a man who'd learned to live, who'd discovered that survival wasn't shameful but was instead the beginning of something larger, more important, more necessary than individual honor. Before he left, Mary Beth gave him a tin of chocolate chip cookies and a photograph of the family gathered on the porch, and Charlie walked him to the car and said, "Don't wait another 30 years to visit. We're not getting any younger." They embraced, and this time there was no awkwardness, just the simple affection of old friends who traveled impossible distances to find each other. On the flight back to Japan, Takashi thought about circles and cycles, about the way life moved in patterns that only became visible from a distance, about the strange alchemy that could transform enemies into friends, hatred into understanding, war into peace. He thought about the young soldier he'd been, so certain of death, so convinced that surrender meant the end of everything meaningful, and he felt compassion for that young man, forgiveness for his fear and confusion and the terrible weight of expectations that had nearly crushed him. He returned home to Yuki and told her about the visit, about the farmhouse and the cornfields and the feeling of sitting on a porch in Iowa drinking Coca-Cola with an old friend while the sun set on another day in a peaceful world. And he realized that this was the meaning he'd been searching for, this simple act of continued existence, of building connections across the boundaries that were supposed to divide, of choosing humanity over ideology, friendship over enmity, life over death. The years continued their forward motion, indifferent to human drama, carrying everyone along in their current. Takashi grew old, watched his children become adults, held his grandchildren, observed Japan's transformation into an economic powerhouse built on the ashes of military defeat. He retired from the factory, spent his days gardening, reading, writing letters to Charlie and receiving letters in return, each exchange a small miracle of connection across distance and difference. He kept the bottle of Coca-Cola from Camp McCoy on a shelf in his study, never opening it, preserving it as a relic of transformation, a symbol of the moment when he'd first understood that enemies could choose to be something else, that the categories of friend and foe were not absolute but were instead constructs that could be dismantled through simple acts of recognition and kindness. When his grandchildren visited, they would point to the bottle and ask about it, and Takashi would tell them the story, watching their faces as they tried to comprehend a world where their grandfather had been an enemy of America, where he'd expected death and received Coca-Cola instead, where guards wore cowboy hats and offered cookies baked by their mothers. The children would listen with the abstract attention of those for whom war was history rather than memory, and Takashi was grateful for this distance, grateful that his grandchildren inhabited a world where the animosity between Japan and America seemed as remote and incomprehensible as conflicts from ancient history. His daughter, Akiko, once asked him whether he'd ever felt angry about the atomic bombs, about the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, about the hundreds of thousands who'd died in those terrible flashes of light. It was a question he'd spent decades considering, turning over in his mind like a stone worn smooth by constant handling. Yes, he told her honestly. I felt angry. I still feel angry. The bombs were terrible, killed innocent people, children, families who had nothing to do with military decisions. But I also feel angry about Pearl Harbor, about the atrocities in China, about all the killing that led to those bombs. War is not a mathematics problem where you can calculate which side was more wrong. War is a collective madness that infects everyone it touches. The only sane response is to refuse to participate in the madness, to insist on seeing the humanity in everyone, even when everything around you says they're monsters who deserve to die. In 1989, Charlie died of a heart attack while working in his fields, and the news reached Takashi through a letter from Mary Beth, her handwriting shaky with grief, asking if he could possibly come to the funeral, saying that Charlie had always considered Takashi one of his closest friends, had talked about him often, had wanted him there for this final farewell. Takashi flew to Iowa again, older now and moving more slowly, his body carrying the accumulated weight of 70 years of living. At the funeral, he met Charlie's children and grandchildren, all of whom knew his name, had heard stories about him, greeted him with warmth and recognition. He stood at the graveside and wept, mourning not just Charlie but the entire generation that had fought the war and somehow managed to build peace from its rubble, that had chosen forgiveness over vengeance, connection over isolation. Mary Beth asked him to stay at the farmhouse for a few days, and he agreed, finding comfort in the familiar spaces that held so many memories of his friend. They sat together in the evenings, Mary Beth and Takashi, two old people who'd lost someone they loved, and they shared stories about Charlie, about his kindness and his optimism and his stubborn belief that people were fundamentally good, that given the chance they would choose understanding over hatred. He never stopped talking about Camp McCoy, Mary Beth said one evening. About how strange it was to guard prisoners and end up becoming friends with them. He said it changed his whole understanding of what war was, what enemies were. Made him question everything he'd been taught about us versus them. I think it made him a better person, meeting you, knowing you. Made him more thoughtful, more careful about believing propaganda, more willing to see complexity instead of just accepting simple narratives about good guys and bad guys. Takeshi felt tears on his face, not from sadness exactly but from the overwhelming recognition of how much Charlie's friendship had meant, how it had shaped his own life in ways both large and small, how a chance encounter in a prison camp had reverberated across decades, creating ripples that touched multiple generations. He saved my life, Takeshi said. Not in a dramatic way. Not by taking a bullet or pulling me from a fire. But by treating me like a human being when I had forgotten that I was one. By sharing cookies and Coca-Cola and stories about Iowa. By showing me that the enemy could have freckles and a fiancé and a mother who baked, could be someone I might have been friends with if we'd met under different circumstances. That gift, that recognition, it allowed me to live with myself, to build a life, to forgive myself for surviving. Before he left Iowa, Mary Beth gave him Charlie's cowboy hat, the one he'd worn at Camp McCoy all those years ago, the one that had struck Takeshi as so absurd on that first day. He'd want you to have this, she said. He kept it all these years, said it reminded him of when he'd been young and had learned the most important lesson of his life. Takeshi took the hat with trembling hands, felt the worn leather of the band, the sweat stain felt that carried Charlie's presence as tangibly as a voice or a laugh. He wore it on the plane back to Japan, ignoring the curious stares, feeling connected to his friend across the boundary of death, across all the boundaries that had ever existed between them. He placed the hat on the shelf next to the Coca-Cola bottle, these two artifacts from Camp McCoy becoming the centerpiece of what his family called his memory shrine, though Takeshi thought of it simply as evidence, proof that what had happened was real, that in the midst of the worst war in human history, there had been moments of grace and connection, that humanity could survive even in circumstances designed to destroy it. In the 1990s, Takeshi was invited to speak at schools about his experiences during the war. He was hesitant at first, uncertain whether he had anything worth saying, whether his story of survival and friendship would resonate with young people who'd grown up in prosperity and peace. But he accepted, and found himself standing before auditoriums full of students, Japanese teenagers who knew about the war primarily through textbooks and museum exhibits, for whom the conflict was as distant as the Meiji Restoration or the Samurai era. He told them about Camp McCoy, about hamburgers and Coca-Cola and cowboy hats, about guards who'd learned to say good morning in Japanese, about friendships that shouldn't have been possible but were. He told them about the shame of surrender and the longer, harder work of learning to live with that shame, to transform it into something more useful than self-destruction. He told them about Charlie and Robert and the camp commander who'd attended the shrine dedication, about small acts of kindness that had accumulated into something transformative. War will tell you that your enemy isn't human, he said to these students, watching their young faces, so unformed, so full of possibility. War will tell you that killing is necessary, that violence is the only language that matters, that survival depends on your willingness to dehumanize others. But I'm here to tell you that war is lying. The enemy has mothers and fathers and hopes and dreams. The enemy gets scared and hungry and tired. The enemy is human, just like you, just like me. And once you truly understand this, once you really see it, war becomes impossible. Not because you're weak or cowardly, but because you can't kill someone whose humanity you've recognized. This is why war works so hard to keep enemies apart, to maintain distance, to prevent the kind of contact that might reveal our fundamental sameness. After these talks, students would approach him with questions, wanting to know more about his experiences, about how he'd dealt with the trauma, about whether he'd ever wanted revenge against the Americans who'd bombed his country. He answered as honestly as he could, trying to convey the complexity of his feelings, the way he could simultaneously hold gratitude for his treatment at Camp McCoy and grief for the destruction of Hiroshima, could see the Americans as both friends and the agents of his country's defeat, could understand that people were capable of both tremendous cruelty and tremendous kindness, sometimes within the same day, sometimes within the same person. One student, a serious boy with glasses who reminded Takeshi of his younger self, asked, "If you could go back, knowing what you know now, would you still become a soldier? Would you still fight?" It was a profound question, one that struck at the heart of everything Takeshi had spent his life contemplating. He thought about the boy he'd been, so certain of his duty, so willing to die for emperor and country. He thought about the man he'd become, shaped by surrender and survival and the unexpected kindness of enemies. "No," he said finally. "I would not fight. But I'm not sure I would have the courage to refuse, either." It's easy to talk about resistance and principle when you're safe, when you're standing in a school auditorium 60 years after the war. It's much harder when you're young and scared and everyone around you is telling you that fighting is the only honorable choice, that refusing means betraying your family, your country, everything you've been raised to value. I don't judge my younger self for fighting. But I hope that by sharing my story, by showing you what war really costs, I can make it a little easier for your generation to choose differently if you're ever faced with similar pressures. Takeshi continued these school visits into his 80s, even as his health declined, even as the effort of standing for an hour became exhausting. He felt an obligation to speak while he still could, to ensure that his generation's experiences weren't lost, that the lessons learned through so much suffering wouldn't have to be relearned by future generations. He knew he was part of a dying breed, the last survivors of a war that had reshaped the world, and he felt the responsibility of memory pressing on him like a weight he couldn't put down. In 2003, he received a letter from one of Charlie's grandchildren, a young woman named Sarah who was studying international relations at university. She was writing a thesis about reconciliation after conflict, about how former enemies could build relationships across the trauma of war, and she wanted to interview him, to hear his story in detail, to understand how his friendship with her grandfather had developed and endured. Takeshi agreed, and Sarah came to Japan, a earnest young woman with her grandfather's red hair and freckles, carrying a recorder and a notebook full of questions. They spent a week together, Takeshi sharing his memories with a completeness he'd never attempted before, describing not just the events but the emotions, the confusion and shame and gradual transformation that had occurred at Camp McCoy. Sarah listened with an intensity that reminded him of why he'd agreed to this, why it mattered to keep telling the story even when it was painful, even when it required him to confront parts of himself he'd rather forget. She asked difficult questions about his guilt, about the other prisoners who'd committed suicide, about how he'd reconciled his treatment at Camp McCoy with the knowledge of atrocities committed by both sides. "I don't think you ever fully reconcile it," he told her. "You learn to live with contradiction, with complexity, with the knowledge that people are capable of both terrible evil and surprising goodness. My time at Camp McCoy didn't erase Japan's war crimes. It didn't make the atomic bombs acceptable. It didn't solve anything on a geopolitical level. But on a personal level, on the level of individual human connection, it showed me that another way was possible. That enemies could choose to see each other differently. That kindness wasn't weakness. That survival didn't have to mean surrendering your humanity." Sarah's thesis, when she sent him a copy, was titled "Coca-Cola and Cowboy Hats: Personal Reconciliation in the Aftermath of the Pacific War." He read it slowly, his old eyes straining over the English text, and felt both proud and humbled to see his story, his friendship with Charlie, presented as an example of what was possible when people chose connection over hatred. The thesis argued that formal reconciliation between nations was important but incomplete, that true peace required millions of individual acts of recognition and understanding, person to person, heart to heart, building a web of relationships that could withstand political tensions and historical grievances. Takeshi's wife Yuki died in 2005, peacefully in her sleep, and he mourned her passing with a grief that felt different from his grief for Charlie, deeper and quieter, the loss of a life partner who'd shared his daily existence for nearly 60 years. His children worried about him living alone, but he insisted on staying in the house they'd built together, surrounded by memories and artifacts and the accumulated debris of a long life. He spent his days tending his garden, reading, corresponding with the extended network of people who'd become part of his story over the decades. Mary Beth wrote to him regularly, her letters arriving with the dependable rhythm of the seasons, keeping him updated on the growing family, on children and grandchildren and now great-grandchildren, on the continuation of life that flowed forward regardless of individual losses. She sent photographs of the farmhouse, still standing, still white-clabbered and wide porch, and Takashi would study these images with the attention of an archaeologist examining ancient ruins, seeing in them the physical proof that the world he briefly inhabited in 1975 continued to exist, that Charlie's legacy persisted in children who carried his genes and grandchildren who farmed his land. On his 90th birthday, Takashi's family organized a celebration, gathering his children and great-grandchildren for a day of food and stories and the gentle chaos of multiple generations occupying the same space. His son Hiroaki, the eldest, had prepared a surprise, a video message from Sarah and from several of Charlie's descendants, all of them speaking directly to the camera, thanking Takashi for his friendship with Charlie, for showing their family that former enemies could become friends, for embodying the kind of forgiveness and openness that made genuine peace possible. Watching the video, Takashi wept openly, no longer caring about maintaining the stoic composure his generation had been taught to value. He wept for Charlie and Yuki and all the people he'd loved and lost. He wept for the young soldier he'd been, so terrified and confused on that first day at Camp McCoy. He wept for all the prisoners who hadn't survived, who'd chosen death over the shame of capture, who'd never gotten to experience the strange gift of unexpected kindness from their enemies. He wept for the world that had been destroyed by war and the world that had been built in its place, imperfect and complicated but alive, still capable of surprising acts of grace. His grandson Kenji asked him that evening, after the other guests had left, what he wanted people to remember about his life. Takashi thought about this question for a long time, sitting in his garden as the sun set, as shadows lengthened and the day cooled. "I want people to remember that I was scared," he said finally. "That I expected death and received Coca-Cola instead. That a guard wearing a cowboy hat taught me that enemies are just people wearing different uniforms, believing different stories about who they're supposed to hate. I want people to remember that war tries to make us forget our humanity, but that humanity is stubborn, persistent, capable of surviving even in prison camps, even across boundaries of language and culture and everything that's supposed to divide us. I want people to remember that friendship is always possible, that it's never too late to choose connection over hatred, that small acts of kindness can echo across generations. That's what I want remembered. Not that I was a hero, because I wasn't. But that I was human, and that I learned to recognize humanity in others, even when everything told me they were monsters." Takashi lived to be 93 years old, dying peacefully in his garden on a spring morning in 2020, surrounded by flowering cherry trees and the vegetables he'd planted the month before. His family found him sitting in his chair, the cowboy hat on his head, the photograph of Charlie and Mary Beth's farmhouse in his lap, a slight smile on his face as if he'd seen something pleasant in his final moments, as if death had come to him as gently as that first sip of Coca-Cola had come all those decades ago at Camp McCoy. At his funeral, his children placed the cowboy hat and the old bottle of Coca-Cola beside his urn, these artifacts from a different era now serving as symbols of a life that had bridged worlds, that had transformed war into understanding, enemies into friends, suffering into wisdom. They invited Sarah and several of Charlie's descendants to attend, and these Americans came, traveling across the Pacific to honor a man they'd never met but whose friendship with their grandfather had become part of their family mythology, a story passed down through generations as evidence that people could choose to be better than their circumstances demanded. Sarah spoke at the funeral, her Japanese halting but sincere, telling the assembled mourners about her grandfather Charlie, about the letters he'd exchanged with Takashi over the years, about the photograph of two old men sitting on a porch in Iowa that hung in her childhood home, a reminder that the categories of friend and enemy were not eternal, that with courage and openness, people could transcend the hatreds that nations imposed upon them. She held up the thesis she'd written 2 decades earlier, now translated into Japanese and published as a book that had reached thousands of readers, and she said that Takashi's life had been a gift not just to his family and friends but to everyone who needed to believe that reconciliation was possible, that wounds could heal, that the future didn't have to repeat the mistakes of the past. After the funeral, Takashi's children donated his collection of letters and photographs to a museum dedicated to Japanese-American relations, wanting to preserve this record of personal diplomacy, of friendship across boundaries. The cowboy hat and the Coca-Cola bottle became part of an exhibit called Unexpected Connections, Personal Stories of Reconciliation After War, displayed alongside artifacts from other prisoners and guards who'd maintained friendships after the war's end, evidence of a pattern that contradicted the simple narratives of eternal enmity that nations sometimes preferred to maintain. Years later, a filmmaker discovered Takeshi's story and created a documentary, interviewing his children and grandchildren, tracking down surviving members of Charlie's family, visiting the site of Camp McCoy and the farmhouse in Iowa, weaving together photographs and letters and old footage into a narrative about the power of individual human connection to undermine the structures of hatred and violence that war depended upon. The documentary aired on both Japanese and American television, reaching millions of viewers, sparking conversations about memory and reconciliation and the choices people made about how to treat their enemies. A high school in Wisconsin, near the site of the old camp, adopted Takeshi and Charlie's story as part of their curriculum, teaching students about the complexity of war, about the human capacity for both cruelty and kindness, about the importance of questioning simple narratives and looking for the humanity in everyone, even those designated as enemies. Students would write essays comparing their own assumptions about current conflicts with the reality that Takeshi and Charlie had discovered, that the enemy is rarely monstrous, that given the chance for genuine human contact, people generally choose connection over violence, understanding over hatred. In Tokyo, a small cafe opened that specialized in American-style hamburgers and served Coca-Cola in glass bottles, decorated with photographs from Camp McCoy and other prisoner-of-war camps where Japanese soldiers had been held during World War II. The owner, Takeshi's granddaughter Ayumi, had grown up hearing his stories and wanted to create a space that honored his memory while also serving as a reminder that food and drink and simple human hospitality could be revolutionary acts, capable of breaking down barriers and creating understanding where none should exist. The cafe became popular with both Japanese customers and American tourists, many of whom came specifically because they'd heard about Takeshi's story, wanting to experience a taste of the unexpected kindness that had defined his time at Camp McCoy. The bottle of Coca-Cola that Takeshi had kept for 76 years, never opening it, preserving it as a sacred relic, remained in the museum, slowly aging, the liquid inside evaporating millimeter by millimeter despite the sealed cap, time taking its inevitable toll even on the most carefully preserved artifacts. But the story it represented, the meaning it carried, these things didn't evaporate. They persisted in memories and letters and documentaries and books and conversations, each retelling adding new layers of interpretation, new relevance to contemporary circumstances, new evidence that the choice between hatred and understanding, between dehumanization and recognition, was a choice that every generation had to make anew, that history's lessons were only valuable if people bothered to learn them and apply them to current circumstances. And so Takeshi's story continued beyond his death, beyond the death of everyone who directly experienced the events at Camp McCoy, becoming part of the larger narrative about war and peace and the complicated process of building understanding between former enemies. It became a story that parents told children, that teachers told students, that friends shared over drinks, each telling slightly different, emphasizing different aspects, but all conveying the essential truth that Takeshi had spent his life trying to communicate, that enemies are made, not born, that humanity persists even in the midst of war, that small acts of kindness can have profound and lasting consequences, that a hamburger and a Coca-Cola offered with genuine care can be more powerful than any weapon, that a cowboy hat worn by a friendly guard can symbolize everything that's possible when people choose to see each other as human beings rather than abstractions to be hated or destroyed. The story lived on, carrying its message forward into a future that Takeshi never saw but had helped to shape through his choices, through his willingness to accept kindness from his enemies, through his commitment to sharing what he'd learned, through his insistence that reconciliation was always possible, always worthwhile, always necessary if humanity was to transcend the cycles of violence that had defined so much of its history. And in this persistence, in this continued relevance, Takeshi achieved a kind of immortality, not as a hero or a saint but as an ordinary person who'd survived extraordinary circumstances and had chosen to build something meaningful from that survival, who'd transformed the trauma of war into wisdom about peace, who'd shown that even in the darkest moments, when everything suggested that cruelty was inevitable and hatred was justified, another choice was possible, another path existed, one that led not to death but to life. not to isolation but to connection, not to the bitterness of eternal enmity but to the sweetness of unexpected friendship, as sweet and surprising as that first taste of Coca-Cola on a summer afternoon in Wisconsin, when a young Japanese soldier discovered that his enemies wore cowboy hats and offered him food and drink and a glimpse of a future he hadn't dared to imagine.